Hi everyone, and welcome to the second video of week 8, in which we will interrogate fake news in its various manifestations. So there are various different things that are called fake news. The first, as you looked at in your reading this week, is news-based parody or current affairs-based parody, comedy, satire. So this is The Daily Show, Last Week Tonight, The Colbert Report. Marchie argues in your reading that Saturday Night Live is also included in there. You could say that. So that was the dominant definition, and if you were to search the Uni Library catalogue for fake news, most of what you would turn up in terms of academic material would be about this sort of satirical news humour. But if you looked in Google, or if you looked in the sort of non-peer-reviewed sections, what you would find is that it is addressing explicitly fake stories that are online. Now, many of these are still have a comedic element, are a satire or otherwise. However, their function is very different than explicitly and obviously satirical show like the ones that I mentioned before. Now, what are the main concerns about fake news? When The Daily Show with Jon Stewart was one of the highest rated news programs and highest sources for people getting their news in the US in, I think, 2008, people were justifiably worried that this was not proper news that people were getting, and that they would end up with a skewed idea of what was going on. Today, we have social media flooded with stories, clickbait or otherwise, that are not true. And in many cases, we clearly identify that these are not true. However, some are, I guess, more effective in misleading people. And this is particularly the case as we're talking about how something feels in the last video, that it might not necessarily be about the facts feeling right, but about how you believe, or the feelings feeling right about the story. Go, oh yeah, that sort of makes sense. That might happen. So we have these two different parts, definitions of fake news. And then more recently added to the pile is the term fake news being used to indicate bias, media bias. So this is particularly on the case for Donald Trump again, who accused CNN in a press conference and in subsequent Twitter and so forth of being fake news because they reported things that were unfavourable. The question of whether something is... You can obviously have a fake news story on CNN, and no doubt there have been some. But for a whole network, a powerful network, to be considered fake news is perhaps, I guess, a diversion on what the term was meant to really describe in its current incarnation of things that are deliberately inflammatory and set out in order to attract public attention and likes and shares and so forth on social media. So I'm not going to use fake news in the last sense. There are definitely there's no doubt fake news stories, but just labelling a network as being fake news belies the actual facts that a lot of what they do, most of what they do, is fact-based. So it becomes a bit of a tautology. So this is a graph from the Pew Research Center looking at Facebook engagements for the top 20 election stories, US election stories in 2016. Now, as you can see here, the mainstream news was, and engagements are likes, shares, any way you explicitly engage with it. As you can see, the mainstream news was definitely winning at the beginning of the campaign, but by the end of the campaign, the amount of engagement with fake news stories had starkly increased and actually surpassed that of the mainstream news. So when we're talking about these sorts of things, we're not talking about a couple of isolated stories. We are talking about things that people don't always engage with these things because they think they're true, but there's certainly a lot of interest and in these sorts of stories, which makes sense. As we talked about last week, you need the drama. They tend to be very dramatic. They tend to be headlines that people want to click on and see what's that talking about. So there's a BuzzFeed list. One tries not to rely on BuzzFeed lists, but this is where the particular data is coming from. So these are the top fake political stories on Facebook for last year and the top fake crime news stories. So you can see, if we look first at the crime news, and I'm going to turn off this picture-in-picture so you can see it properly. You can see the top crime news one is probably attracting people's attention to go and see what's going on there, but also probably obviously pretty fake, as is the next one. They tend to be either gross or dramatic in some way. The one there that's probably the most potentially troubling fake crime news story is police find 19 white female bodies in freezers with Black Lives Matter carved into skin. So we do live in a sufficiently awful at times world where people might go, oh, you know, there's been these terrible murders and that's what's happened, which may lead to having certainly a very negative perception of Black Lives Matter, or at least people who identify with it. If you look at the political news stories on your left, this one, 2.2 million shares, comments and reactions. Obama signs executive order banning the Pledge of Allegiance in schools nationwide. Now this, we don't have a Pledge of Allegiance here, but this is a very dramatic thing to say, but it's something that if you were suspicious of Obama, you might well believe that he had done that, and that would definitely increase your negative perception. Pope Francis endorsed Donald Trump. I must confess, I clicked on this one too, though I didn't do any engagement, so I'm not counted in there. So you can see the political news stories on the fake political news stories overwhelmingly favour one political side over the other, and this is what was found in the campaign, that fake political news did seem to particularly favour the Republican side. There is much speculation as to why that might be, but I think suffice to say that it did. So going to a story from not that long ago, from early last week, there has been a huge spike in fake news in the context of the French election. And this is a very important election because there is some anti-EU sentiment, significant anti-EU sentiment in one of the candidates, one of the parties. So the outcome of the French election might spell the outcome of the EU, because if they withdrew as well, then that that would be very difficult for the EU to continue, or at least in the same manner that it had been, with Britain already left. So it's an extremely high stakes election, not just for France, but for the rest of Europe. And there are, as you can see, the 30 most popular fake or misleading articles were shared almost 1 million times in the last 2 months. So they are really, there is really a potential here, even if it is used in a satirical way, for there to be a political knock-on effect from these sorts of shares. And a lot of them do, again, favour the more conservative party. So they're often used in things like the example in the second paragraph, 15 million views on Facebook since March 18. It is a video of a Russian, from a Russian hospital, of a man assaulting 2 women, and that this was reposted to, which is terrible, but this was then reposted as a French news story that these were migrants who were attacking a French woman. So you're sort of setting up a certain kind of discourse, feeding into a discourse that already exists among segments of the French population who are dissatisfied with immigration and this sort of thing. So here's some examples. So Trudeau promises Canadian citizens a wall, US will pay. Now, if you're someone who thinks that the whole build a wall, Mexico will pay line of Donald Trump's was, you know, a bit silly or whatever, this is obviously coming across as humorous and satirical. If you think that building a wall is fine and that might be what you would do, then maybe it's not as clear. So I guess the idea is that all humour and all satire is contextual, and it relies on people to understand it, as we looked at in representation, to understand lots of different codes and cultural contexts. Here's another fake news story. Obama's mother-in-law charged with larceny and fraud. From the other side of the fence, Sarah Palin calls to boycott Mall of America, and this went around. Again, it is not the case that these are not satirical pieces, but the question then is of I guess, how do they contribute towards a particular kinds of discourse? This one is definitely more sinister and fitting in with that other fake news story of the women found that was in the crime news, and that it was claimed that they had Black Lives Matter. Here's a fake news story proclaiming that Black Lives Matter activists, or thugs as they say here, have set 2 guys on fire, which is a huge and outrageous claim, and if it were true, it would be outrageous, and people should justifiably be up in arms. But as it is not true, what effect is it then potentially having in setting up maybe not what people think the facts are, though it could very well be that too, but how people feel about certain things? The thing that really brought fake news into mainstream news consciousness was so-called Pizzagate, which is a very silly name for a very full-on thing. Essentially, there was a fake news story going around saying that Hillary Clinton and a few other people were running child sex trafficking slavery thing in the basement of a pizza shop. Now that sort of sounds set up that like you're like, well, but why would anyone, you know, take that seriously? That sounds ridiculous. But it sort of spread like wildfire, and there were, you know, there was a lot of interpretation of, oh, there was this symbol, and that symbol means this, and it all became quite a large thing online. And essentially, at one, it ended up with someone taking a gun, or a couple of guns, I think, and going down to attempt to shoot people in the pizza shop in the name that he wanted to do a self-investigation. He wanted to go and see what was going on and potentially rescue the kids. So the difficulty of dissuading people can be seen in that after that incident, when people were justifiably horrified that something that was either a prank or a sort of malicious political act resulted in someone going to that kind of a length. But as a result of this, a lot of the people who were engaged by this story and this conspiracy were still saying, oh, this was all a setup to kind of distract attention from what's really going on, and the guy was an actor and all this sort of stuff. So it is not always the case that it is easy to snap people out of things once a sort of a group discourse has grown around it. So please go to this YouTube video and watch it. There have been responses to this. There's sites like PolitiFact or Fact Check, or this is not always politically oriented, Snopes, who for some time have been looking into things that may or may not be true, so particularly promises by politicians, and seeing whether or not they check out. Often they don't check out, so they're really good sources to go for if you do read something and you're not sure what it is. An academic at a university in America also went through and did her own list of 150 odd sites where fake news stories originate. I imagine these changed pretty quickly. PolitiFact has now done one as well. So I guess the idea is that in response to these sorts of practices, there are two things. To respond to them, you need to do one of two things, or two of two things. Either figure out, either get rid of the fake news stories, and this is something that Facebook and Google, particularly Facebook, but also Google, been put under pressure to do, is to find a way to not have so many of them, because Facebook, it has most of them. It's been a very big source. But also to learn how to distinguish fake news from real news. And that is critical thinking, or media literacy. And critical thinking is something you will be marked on many, many times during the course of your degree. This week in the workshop, we're going to work through some examples of how you can use critical thinking to identify truth in things that are quite emotional arguments, and I think you'll find that very useful. So do make sure you check in this week, or if you can't make it, to listen to the recording. I'd also like you to watch this BBC news clip that is just summarising and going over some issues about fake news and so forth. It talks a lot about, oh, there's the UK and then there's America, but really the media is so global at this point that I think that distinguishing it in quite the way they do is a little bit, is not that useful. But the clip is very good in terms of thinking through, sort of recapping these issues and thinking through some of doing your own analysis of how this is being presented and argued. Oh, just as a side note on the media literacy element, Taiwan has just announced that in their curriculum, in their high school curriculum, they're now going to teach students how to identify fake news. So it is sort of, I guess, people are starting to recognise that there are definitely problems with this, and maybe this will lead to greater media literacy for everyone, which I think is always a good thing. So I will post the rest of the videos on Wednesday, and I'll see you later. Bye.